Treating the Sick, page 84. Dr. Monocles squinted at the patient on the cot nearest the door, then turned to Tremolo and Cassia behind him. "We may as well begin here. Your complaint, sir?" Cassia bit his lip. The patient's cheeks were pale, and sweat glistened on his forehead. "Probably has a fever," Cassia told himself, his eyes scanning the man's face for other signs of distress. As he watched, the patient pressed one hand tightly against his eardrum. "Earache," the patient whispered. Monocles frowned as though he were looking at some unusual form of insect life. "Speak up." The patient winced and tried again. "Earache," he murmured. A look of impatience crossed Monocles' face. "Eh?" Cassius swallowed hard. He knew he was only supposed to observe. He was here in the hospital outside Athens to see how a master physician such as Monocles cared for patients. With luck, he knew, the great doctor would take him on as a student. It was not for Cassia himself to make remarks. Still, since Monocles seemed to be unable to hear the patient, "He says he has an earache," Cassia explained shyly. "Ah, an earache." Monocles straightened up. His lips curved into a satisfied smile. "Bleed him," he said. "Bleed him," echoed Tremolo, Monocles' assistant, pulling a knife from a small box at his side. "Bleed him?" repeated Cassia with a frown, watching as Tremolo sharpened the knife. Monocles gave a long, drawn-out sigh. "Bleed him," he said again, straightening up and directing the words of Cassia. "Bleeding is best for earaches. That and prayer." He turned to the patient again. "Go to the temple, pray loudly, for relief from—" He blinked and frowned. "From what was it?" "Earaches," supplied Tremolo as he made a small cut in the patient's arm. "We'll do this every day until you're well again," he said as the blood began to flow. "Or until you die from loss of blood, whichever comes first," thought Cassia as Tremolo led the way to the next bed. To Cassia, the patient with the earache seemed to need something other than bloodletting. Gently he ran his hand across the man's forehead. He had a fever, too. What was Dr. Monocles going to do about that? Nothing, he said to himself. Monocles hadn't even noticed. Perhaps staying here in Athens was the wrong move. Monocles had a fine reputation in town, and Athens was certainly convenient, but Cassius still wasn't sure. He had heard about a doctor on the far-off island of Kos, a man with hard name, Hippocalypse, Hypotenuse. No, Hippocrates was that. That was it. Page 88. Hippocrates was a forward-thinking physician. The human body is a circle, Hippocrates had written. His meaning had been clear to Cassia. The body was a circle because every part was connected. You could not hope to heal unless you examined the whole body, the whole person, the whole soul. He frowned. Somehow, Dr. Monocles seemed not to understand that part. "Well, he's almost cured," Monocles said, jutting out his chin with pride. "All it takes, my boy, is a fine doctor like me, a doctor who can cure anyone given enough time." "Yes, sir," said Cassia dutifully, but he wondered. According to Hippocrates, bodies healed themselves. In his view, the physician was only a helper. If the man with the earache gets well, he asked himself, will it be because of Monocles, or because the man's own body cleansed itself? He stepped to the next patient's bedside. This fellow was old and thin, his beard was tangled, and his sheets filthy. As Cassia watched, the man drew in a wheezing breath and then exploded in a series of hacking coughs. Soon, the man was doubled up, gasping for air. Page 89. "What's your trouble?" Monocles squinted down at the patient. The man cannot breathe, Cassia thought impatiently. Why ask when the answer is staring you in the face? Hippocrates would treat this man with care and compassion, he told himself. At least, according to everything he had heard about the doctor from Kos. Where is a love of medical arts? Hippocrates had written. There is also a love of humanity. Cassio was not sure whether Monocles loved the medical arts, but he suspected the doctor did not have any great love for humanity. It was a pity that Cos was so distant, he reflected with a sigh. Cannot breathe, the patient husked, breaking into another series of coughs. A cough, I believe, Monocles said proudly. A great doctor can always tell. Surgery is called for. Prepare the saw. Bleed him first, of course. Bleed him? Echoed Tremolo, scurrying forward with the knife. Surgery? Cassius stared at the physician. Fresh air might help, he thought. Warm compresses on his chest could help too. Even a clean sheet might do some good. But surgery? What part should they cut? Hippocrates had something to say about that, too, Cassio recalled. He would say something about cures needing to connect to the complaint. He'd talk about having an open and scientific mind. Dr. Monocles, Cassio began. Surgery is good for the sick, snapped Monocles. Oh, and don't forget to pray, too. We'll be back in an hour to cut out the part that ails you, or some part anyhow. Next? Through the ward they hurried at breakneck speed. By the end of an hour, Cassio could have given Monocles answers himself, and in his head he did just that, imitating the bored voice of the doctor. Bleed and cut and bleed. The exact complaint did not seem to matter. The cure was always the same. Ready? Asked Monocles, peering over the bedside of the man with the cough. His saw was in his hand. Ready, said Tremolo cheerfully, holding one of the man's arms tightly against the bed. Cassio bit his lip, but held down the other arm, as he'd been told. Oh, please, whimpered the patient. Hush, suggested Monocles. We have 7 more to do. Time flies, you know. The man screamed, began to struggle, and suddenly jerked free. Pray, Monocles called, as the man, still coughing, disappeared out the door. What had Hippocrates said? Prayer indeed is good, Cassio quoted softly, but while calling on the gods, a man should himself lend a hand. A man should indeed, he thought, and so should a doctor, a helpful hand. And in that instant Cassio made up his mind. Well, my boy, said Dr. Monocles later that day, what do you think? He draped a hand on Cassio's shoulder. Cassio shuddered. His hand was a little dirty. You think too much for a lowly student, I fear? Still, I'll do you a favor and take you on. No need to thank me. Cassio thought one last time of Monocles' one cure-fits-all approach to healing, of his failure to think of patients as people. Then he thought of Hippocrates of Cos and his sense of ethics. He believed that the patient was a whole person and a unique individual. Somehow, traveling to Kos no longer seemed impossible. No, thank you, he said, gently but firmly removing Monocles' hand from his shoulder.